They said it was impossible. Every music journalist who covered the story, every industry insider who knew the numbers, every analyst who looked at the sales figures and tried to make sense of what they were seeing. A band that had stopped releasing music. A band that had never toured again. A band that had given no interviews, no appearances, no reason whatsoever for the world to keep paying attention. And yet, the world kept paying attention. More than that, the world kept falling in love with them. New people, new countries, new generations who had not been born when ABBA was at its peak. How does that happen? How does a band that disappeared become more famous in its absence than most bands become in their entire careers? That band was ABBA, and this is the story nobody told you. Before we go any further, think about this. Name one other band in the history of popular music that stopped recording in 1982 and by 1999 had a hit musical running in London's West End. Name one other group that dissolved quietly, without announcement, without farewell, and 40 years later released an album that went to #1 in multiple countries. You can't, because there isn't one. What happened to ABBA after they disappeared is not just a music industry story. It is something closer to a mystery. And like all good mysteries, the answer was hiding in plain sight the whole time. ABBA's last official recording was made in early 1982. The Visitors album had been released the previous year. The four members had drifted apart, not dramatically, not with a public announcement, but quietly, inevitably, in the way that things end when the people involved have run out of reasons to continue and the courage to say so. By the time 1982 arrived, ABBA had effectively ceased to exist. They just hadn't told anyone yet. The music industry moved on. New bands emerged. New sounds took over the radio stations. The synthesizer-driven pop of the early 1980s made ABBA's lush orchestral productions sound, briefly, dated. There was a period, a window of perhaps 3 or 4 years, when ABBA was not cool, when the sequined costumes and the Eurovision origins and the unabashed melodic optimism of their early work felt like a different era, a more innocent era, one that the harder-edged 1980s had no particular use for. But then something strange happened, something that nobody in the music industry had predicted, and nobody fully understood when it began. The songs kept playing, not on the radio stations that chased trends, but in the places where music lives longest, in homes, in cars, in the private moments when people reach for something that feels true. Mothers played Dancing Queen for their daughters. Fathers played Fernando on long drives. The Winner Takes It All played at funerals, and at the ends of relationships, and at the moments when people needed language for something they couldn't say themselves. And slowly, quietly, ABBA began to grow again, not despite their absence, because of it. There is a theory in music, not widely discussed, but widely felt, that some songs exist outside of time, that they are not products of their era, but expressions of something more permanent, something that was true before the song was written, and will be true long after everyone who made it is gone. The melody of Dancing Queen, the opening chord of The Winner Takes It All, the way Agnieszka's voice rises on the word winner, as if the word itself costs something to say. These are not 1970s sounds, they are human sounds, and human sounds do not go out of fashion. By the late 1980s, ABBA's catalogue had begun doing something remarkable. It was selling. Not in the way that nostalgia sells, with a brief spike and then a long decline, but steadily, consistently, in markets all over the world. Compilation albums were shifting millions of copies. Radio stations that had moved on were quietly moving back. And a generation of artists who had grown up listening to ABBA, artists who would go on to shape the sound of the 1990s, were beginning to say so publicly. In 1992, the Australian film Muriel's Wedding used ABBA songs as its emotional backbone. The film was a hit, and something about seeing those songs in a new context, used not as nostalgia, but as genuine emotional currency, reminded people why they had loved them in the first place. The songs weren't old. They had just been waiting for the right moment to be new again. In 1994, a tribute album called ABBA Gold. ABBA Gold had actually been released in 1992, and it became one of the best-selling compilation albums in history. It has never left the UK charts. Not once. In over 30 years, it has always been there, selling, every week, to someone who is hearing these songs for the first time, or hearing them again after years, and feeling something they cannot quite explain. Think about what that means. Most albums, even great ones, have a lifespan. They peak. They fade. They become historical objects, things you find in second-hand shops and remember fondly. ABBA Gold never faded. It never became a historical object. It remained stubbornly, defiantly alive, as if the music inside it refused to behave the way music is supposed to behave. And then, in 1999, Mamma Mia opened. The musical had been conceived by Judy Kramer, who had spent years trying to convince ABBA's management that their songs could form the backbone of a stage show. The concept was simple, deceptively simple. Take the songs, build a story around them, let the music do what it had always done, which was make people feel things they didn't expect to feel, in places they didn't expect to feel them. The show opened at the Prince Edward Theatre in London on April 6th, 1999. The reviews were mixed. Some critics found it lightweight. Some found it brilliant. But the audiences did not care what the critics thought. They came. They laughed. They cried. They left the theatre singing. And they came back. Again and again and again.
What Mamma Mia did for ABBA's legacy cannot be overstated. It introduced the music to an entirely new generation, people who had not been born in 1974, who had no memory of Eurovision, who had never seen the sequined costumes or the hairstyles or the television performances. For these people, ABBA was not nostalgia. ABBA was simply music. Music that made them feel something. Music that worked. And this is the thing that the music industry had missed, and that Judy Kramer had understood from the beginning. ABBA's songs were not products of a moment. They were not tied to a specific cultural context that would eventually expire. They were built on something more fundamental, on the universal human experiences of love and loss and joy and grief, and the complicated feeling of wanting something you cannot have. And those experiences do not expire. The musical ran for years in London. Then it went to Broadway. Then it went everywhere. By the time the film adaptation was released in 2008, with Meryl Streep and a cast of Hollywood's most celebrated actors, ABBA had completed one of the most extraordinary reversals in popular music history. They had gone from a band that had quietly dissolved in 1982 to a global cultural institution, without releasing a single new song, without a single tour, without a single public appearance as a group. The four members watched all of this from a distance. Agneta from her house outside Stockholm, where she had retreated years earlier. Anni-Frid from Switzerland, where she had built a quiet life far from the noise of fame. Benny from his studio, where he was always working on something new. Bjorn from wherever Bjorn happened to be, always thinking, always writing, always turning the world into material. They gave occasional interviews. They spoke warmly about the music. They deflected questions about a reunion with the kind of practiced ease that suggested they had been deflecting those questions for a very long time. No,
They would not be touring. No, there would not be new recordings. No, ABBA was not coming back. They were polite about it. They were consistent about it. And for years, they meant it. But here is the thing about truly great creative partnerships. They don't fully end. They pause. They go quiet. They wait. And sometimes, after enough time has passed, after enough life has been lived, after the hurt has faded and the perspective has deepened and the distance has given everything a different shape, sometimes the music calls. And when it calls, it is very hard to say no. In 2016, Benny and Bjorn began talking, not about ABBA specifically, about music, about what they might want to make, about whether there was anything left that could only be made by all four of them together. The conversations were private, careful, exploratory. Nobody announced them. Nobody knew they were happening. And then, slowly, the circle widened. Anni-Frid joined the conversation. And then, after more time, more care, more of the quiet negotiation that happens between people who have known each other for 50 years and carry all of that history in the room with them, Agneta said yes. The recording sessions for Voyage began in 2018. They were kept completely secret. In an era when nothing stays secret, when every significant cultural event is leaked and speculated about and reported before it happens, ABBA managed to record an entire album in Stockholm without anyone finding out. This is either a testament to the loyalty of everyone involved, or evidence that ABBA operates by different rules than the rest of the music industry. Possibly both. The sessions were not easy. How could they be? These were four people in their 70s, who had last made music together when they were in their 30s and 40s, who had lived entire lives in the decades between, who carried with them everything that had happened, the marriages, the divorces, the years of silence, the strange experience of watching their own music become a global institution without them. Walking back into a studio with all of that history required something extraordinary from each of them. Benny spoke about it afterward with his characteristic directness. He said there had been nerves, that it had felt strange at first, that the studio was familiar, but everything else was different. And then, when the music started, something shifted. The voices found each other, the harmonies clicked into place, and the strangeness dissolved into something that felt inevitable, as if this was always going to happen, as if the 40 years between had been necessary, not wasted, but necessary. Time that had to pass before this particular music could be made. Don't miss this detail. The two new singles released ahead of the album, I Still Have Faith in You and Don't Shut Me Down, were not attempts to recreate the past. They were something new. Songs that could only have been written by people who had lived what ABBA had lived, that carried the weight of everything that had come before, and the particular lightness that sometimes comes on the other side of surviving something difficult. They sounded like ABBA, but they sounded like ABBA at 70, which is a different thing, a more interesting thing, a thing that only time can make. The album was announced in September 2021. The reaction was unlike anything the music industry had seen in years. Not because people were surprised that ABBA had made new music, although they were, but because of what it felt like to hear those voices again. Millions of people who had grown up with those songs, who had danced to them and cried to them and driven to them and sat in silence with them, heard I Still Have Faith in You for the first time and felt something they could not quite name, something between recognition and grief and joy and gratitude. The particular feeling of something you thought was gone, turning out to still be there. Voyage entered the charts at number 1 in the UK, number 1 in multiple European countries.
It became the fastest-selling album of 2021. Critics who had spent their careers writing about music reached for words that felt inadequate to the occasion. They called it a miracle, a gift, an event. But here is what it actually was. It was proof. Proof of something that ABBA's music had been demonstrating for 40 years, quietly, consistently, without needing to announce itself. That some things are built to last. That some voices carry something that time cannot erode. That the songs you make from the truest parts of yourself, the songs that cost you something real, those songs do not belong to a decade. They belong to something larger, something permanent. ABBA sold more records than almost any band in history, more than most people realise, more than many bands that are considered more culturally significant. And they did it without ever chasing trends, without ever compromising the essential character of what they made, and without ever fully understanding, until very late, why it worked so well. The answer is the same answer it has always been. The music was real. The people who made it were real. The joy and the grief and the love and the loss that went into those recordings were real. And real things, genuinely real things, do not disappear. They accumulate. They deepen. They find new listeners in new generations who hear in them something they recognise from the inside. The stage lights may have gone out in 1982, but the sound they left behind, that particular, irreplaceable, unrepeatable sound, has been ringing ever since. In every country, in every language, in every moment when someone needed music that told the truth. And it will keep ringing, long after all of us are gone, long after the questions about reunions and tours and new albums are no longer relevant. Long after everything that seemed important about the music industry of the 1970s has been forgotten. Because Dancing Queen was never really about the 1970s. And The Winner Takes It All was never really about a divorce. And Waterloo was never really about a battle. They were always about something else. Something that doesn't have a name. Something you feel in your chest when the music starts. Something that makes you stop whatever you are doing and just listen. That is what ABBA sold more of than the Beatles. Not records. That feeling. And you cannot put a number on that. You cannot chart it. You cannot explain it. You can only, when it happens, be grateful that someone made it. And somewhere in Stockholm, 4 people who made something that will outlast all of them know exactly what that means.